Have you ever thought about why it is that the early church grew so fast and so far? I mean, we know the story of Jerusalem and how they grew because of the apostles' teaching and them working powerful miracles. And Luke gives us status reports, how they go from just a handful to 3,000 on the very first day, and then 5,000. And then after that, Luke stopped several times just to let us know, and a great number were added. But then as we get to the middle of the first century, things start slowing down. The churches that we run into on Paul's missionary journeys and others are small and they're struggling. The beginnings of persecution are starting. And so messages to those churches in books like 1 Peter and Hebrews and others are like, hold on, keep it together, just keep struggling on. Because persecution was starting and hardship and difficulty. So how did the church grow despite that? Well, in large part they grew because not they had some grand church growth or missionary strategy. They took the long view of things. They just kept doing what God called them to do. Kind of like the song that we sang earlier, let me shine your light all around, but first, help me to live it, Lord. They lived the Word of God. They lived their message, and to a degree, that's what caught the attention of the Romans. Let me share one way that they did that, but first a little historical background. Rome was the only superpower in the world, of course, at the time the New Testament was written. They valued strength. Rome had no place for weakness. And that's seen in a lot of ways, but one way that's seen is in the widespread Roman practice that they referred to as exposure. We would call infanticide. They took babies that were undesirable or less desirable for whatever reason. They were deformed, they were weak, they were in some cases female. And they would take them to the woods and they would expose them to the elements and expose them to the whim of the gods. And that way discarding the babies that they didn't want. Now, in some ways that makes a lot of sense because Rome's own self-identity, the way they understood themselves, is in the story of Romulus and Remus, two babies that were abandoned in their infancy, but were raised by wolves. And later Romulus came back and founded the city of Rome, which bears his name. So this idea that we value strength and therefore we've got to make sure that only the strong survive. And so some of the great thinkers, the Greek philosopher Aristotle, whose philosophy undergirds much of the Roman ideal, said, let there be a law that no deformed child shall be reared. And it was Cicero, the Roman statesman, deformed infants shall be killed. And then Seneca, the Roman philosopher, mad dogs we knock on the head, unnatural prodigy, unwanted children we destroy. So the idea of the Romans was that children belonged to the father, and the father decided which children lived and which children died. A child was only a child if it was wanted. That should cause us to think a little bit about our modern situation. But then there were Christians who didn't believe that children belonged to the Father, but that children belonged to the Father, the Heavenly Father. They belonged to God. Children were a blessing from God. And so what they began to do was to follow people that were abandoning babies into the woods and rescuing those babies and raising them as their own. At first, Romans, detested that. It was just one of many reasons why Romans detested the church. Eventually, they began to listen because it showed the love of God in a way that was powerful. In the Roman catacombs underneath Rome, there are burial plots largely, and there are many burial plots that have the inscription, here lies so-and-so, the adopted son or daughter of so-and-so. This explosion of adoptees because Christians were adopting children. In fact, there's one whole section that has infants that were buried, and only 5 of 83 of them have inscriptions of the name. The rest of them, the only inscription that covers the whole group of little tiny graves is, suffer the little children to come unto me, for such is the kingdom of heaven. Christians having a sway. Now, again, the Romans didn't like that at first. But all of a sudden, they noticed that the Christian message of love, of God's love, and love your neighbor as yourself was being seen in the fact that they took in and adopted these babies. And the more that Rome saw the love of God exemplified in the life as well as the message of the church, the more they paid attention to the Christian message. So I mentioned earlier, we continue this morning looking at the Gospel of Luke, which we've given the title to the series, Christ for All. Because Luke seems to be concerned about stressing stories, including stories about Jesus that shows him being inclusive to people that really didn't have a place in the first century. We've seen last week how Luke puts a special emphasis on the poor. The week before that, including women into his ministry. And today, how Jesus received children. And so let's look quickly at an overview of how Luke stresses children, and then we'll look more specifically at what that may mean for us. Luke contains all of the stories that we have about the childhood of Jesus. Now, granted, not very many, but the rest of the gospel writers don't include that at all. In fact, Mark jumps even over the birth of Jesus. But Luke has the stories that we are familiar with. We'll mention in a second. We would say, Lord, why didn't you include more stories about the infant Jesus? That comes up in Sunday school classes. Why didn't God tell us more about Jesus as a child? I don't know. He just chose not to. But the church, as often it does, filled in some of the details with some ancient legends and stories that, though not canonical and probably not historical, showed the church's interest in the idea of Jesus as a child. So these stories come down to us of Jesus forming these birds out of clay and then clapping his hands and the birds spring to life. And then there's this bully that was causing problems in the village, and Jesus curses him and he drops dead. Then Jesus prays to the Father and raises the child up to life. And then there's all kinds of, the favorite story, the one that appears most, is Jesus as a toddler, Jesus as a young child, confounding the rabbis at synagogue, asking all kinds of questions and twisting them in knots, kind of preparing Jesus for his ministry a little bit later. Now, those stories probably didn't happen, but interestingly, Anne Rice worked that into a wonderful little book called Christ the Lord out of Egypt, where she kind of wove together all of those stories and told the story of Jesus from his perspective as a child. That became the basis of a movie that some of you have seen, because we showed it here one time, The Young Messiah. Those stories are kind of stories we would like to have, but God chose not to tell us. But all that we do have of Jesus as a child is in Luke. So it's Luke that tells us after his birth that he was circumcised on the 8th day according to the law of Moses in Bethlehem. And then he was presented at the temple after the proper sacrifices were given of ritual of purification. And there at the temple, he meets Anna, the prophetess, and Simeon, the prophet, who speak words of prophecy over this infant Jesus. And it's Luke, of course, that does have the story of the 12-year-old Jesus that gets lost from his parents when they make this trip to Jerusalem for Passover. And, well, he's not lost. He knows right where he is. It's his mother and father lose track of him. And when they finally found him, he kind of dismisses them a little bit by saying, didn't you know? I have to be about my father's business. Well, we wouldn't have even those stories if it wasn't for Luke. So Luke has a way of stressing Jesus as a child. In fact, he gives us these progress reports. In Luke 20 and verse 40, and the child grew and became strong, and he was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. And then a little bit later, after the getting lost in the temple story, and Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor of God and man. But still, we want to know how he grew in wisdom and stature. Most of all, what would be a great thing to know, at least very interesting. When did Jesus come to know that he was the Son of God? What was the process where he came to self-identity, self-awareness that he was not just human, but divine? That's really the point of Anne Rice's book, as the 7-year-old Jesus finally comes to the conclusion there's something different about me. Again, we're not told, but what little we are told of the childhood of Jesus comes from Luke. And then there are all kinds of stories in Luke where Jesus has interaction with children. On one occasion, in Luke's telling of it, there's this time where Jesus is arguing with the Pharisees. The Pharisees are and scribes, the teachers of the law, and they're having. Jesus is talking about John the Baptist, his identity, and they're arguing back and forth. And Jesus uses a child's song or poem to compare the Jewish leaders to. So in Luke 7, verse 31, to what then shall I compare the people of this generation? What are they like? They are like children sitting in the marketplace and calling out to each other. We played the pipe for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge and you did not cry. Now the point he's making is the scribes and Pharisees just couldn't, the kids are saying, hey, we played a happy song, you didn't dance. We played a sad song, you didn't cry. There's no pleasing you. That's the point of the children's book. And he's saying the Pharisees are just like that. John the Baptist, he says, came not eating bread and not drinking wine. He ate bugs. And you said he has a demon. But then I come and I both eat bread and drink wine. Jesus was social, he goes to banquets. And you say I'm nothing but a glutton and a wine bibber. No satisfying you. But the interesting thing is he makes that point by quoting a children's song. How did Jesus know what children are crying out in the marketplace? Because, as we find later in the book, he spends a lot of time with children. Then Luke has the story, as Matthew does, of people bringing infants to Jesus to be blessed by Jesus. The apostles think they're running interference. They're the security team. And so the mothers come with their children and they says, no. We're founding a nation here. We don't have time for your kids. And Jesus rebukes them and says, suffer the little children to come to me. And he blesses them all. Well, Luke has that just as Matthew does. But then Luke has a similar story, totally different incident, but another time where Jesus is with children. So this is in Luke 9. Verse 47, Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. Then he said to him, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For it is the one who is least among you all who is the greatest. Okay, so the apostles, here's the context. The apostles are arguing about which of them is the greatest. It's interesting how often that comes up in the gospel stories. In one gospel, two of the disciples come in, James and John, and asked to be sitting in the place of honor with Jesus. They thought they were the greatest. In another of the gospels, it actually gives us a little more details. It wasn't James and John that came. It was their mama that came and asked for the great. And they're arguing. In fact, in Luke's telling, they argue about who is the greatest right down to the Last Supper. That's the last time they have that argument. And then hours later, Jesus is arrested. Well, see, this isn't bragging rights that they're arguing about. This is who gets the best place in the new administration, who gets to be the Secretary of State, and who has to be Secretary of Dog Catching. That's what they're arguing about. They're arguing about their status. And Jesus takes a child, and you can almost imagine him putting his arm around the child. He says, you want to be great in the kingdom? Here's your model. You need to become like this child. Whoever welcomes this child, remember the apostles had chased the children and their parents away. Whoever welcomes this child, that's who's greatest. The one that serves this child, that's who's the greatest. The one who welcomes this child, that's who is the greatest in the kingdom. It's not status, it's service. And Jesus uses a child as his example of that. Okay, so we see in Luke there's this emphasis on children, and especially an emphasis on how Jesus welcomes children. So what's the application for us? Okay, let's go back over it. We began by talking about how the church's view of children was greatly different than the culture, that they valued children, even unwanted ones. And then when we looked at Luke, we saw that Luke put an emphasis on the childhood of Jesus and shared some stories of Jesus when he was a child. And then Luke has more stories about Jesus' interaction with child. It seems like every time he's teaching, there's a child there that he can place his hands on or use as an illustration. He refers to them in the songs they sing. So Jesus welcomed children. Jesus thought children were important. What's the application to us? Well, you know what the application is. We need to make sure our children are valued, know that they're valued, because of that God values them. Any growing, vibrant church is going to have a vibrant children's ministry. Those two just go together. Now, sometimes, the church is more interested in managing noise, and so they make sure that children are in different places. I visited a church one time that had a big graved placard in brass at their auditorium that said, during worship hours, children are not welcome in the auditorium. Please make use of children's ministry. Engraved in brass. Well, that sort of says something. That sort of says that children are a disruption. I remember when we were having all kind of small groups, and we sort of, we had, at one time 8 different small groups and met in homes all around the area. And the general consensus was, I don't know that we came out and said this. Yeah, I think we did. Some of us did. Children are a real problem. We don't know what to do with kids during the small groups because if they stay in, they're kind of disruptive. And if we take them out and babysit them, then that takes somebody out of the group. So I don't think a church is going to be strong and vibrant if we ever see children as an interruption or a problem. They are not just the church of the future, they're the church of now. So if we're going to have a growing church, then we need to have a vibrant children's ministry. So what do? I wanted to say 2 things, and then the lesson will be done. First, to parents. We need our parents to be more demanding and dependable. Demanding in the sense of you need to expect us to do what we can, the very best that we can, to minister to and serve your children. You need to know that we think your children are important. And if you think we're not doing that, if you see some things that we can do better, then if you, as we say on other things, if you see something, say something. Help us to know what it is that we can do to better serve your children. Because they are important to us, even if we aren't as successful as we would like to be in demonstrating that. And we need you to be more dependable. Here's what I mean by that. The children's program needs to be seen as involving everyone. We sometimes ask for volunteers. We need more people to step up and volunteer. And the way that we do our children's classes now during the sermon time means that to volunteer to teach means you're not in the rest of the worship, so we need to spread that around. But here's what I'm really talking about. The most important thing you can do to minister to your kids, and the most important thing you can do to help the church have a vibrant and growing children's ministry, is have your kids in church every week. It makes a credible difference when our teachers, now I know our teachers spend a lot of time on their lessons. I know that because my wife is going to be teaching until summer break. She thinks it's very important, and we spend part of our Saturdays every week. Time when I should be watching football, going around to thrift stores and craft stores, trying to find things that would be useful in helping drive that lesson home with crafts. So we need your kids to be there. Because teaching a group of 2 or 3 has a whole lot different feel than teaching a group of 7 or 8. So the more kids that we can have there, plus then when guests come, it's a whole lot more of an impression when their children are mixed in with a full class than it is when there's just a few. So we need us all to be depended upon to making a focus on our children's program, the best thing we can do is make sure our kids are there every week. Second, we need the church to be more demanding and dependable. Dependable in the sense that we need to do a better job of communicating. We need to be a better job of informing. We need to be a better job of letting you know what is going on with our kids. And then we also need to be a little more demanding of ourselves. Appreciate so much Shirley and her emphasis on having different activities for the kids. That's important for her, and that should be important to all of us. And I think we can do a good job in making that even more of a focus. We're reaching a milestone this year, and you probably haven't thought about this. I've thought about it a lot. This year, we turned 50. December, the second Sunday in December, the Denby Church will turn 50. Statistically, that is a danger zone. Because once churches have life cycles, and once churches get to a certain age, then, both in the age of the congregation in particular, and also in the age of the members of the congregation, they fall into ruts and we do things the way that we've always done them and that sort of thing. And if churches don't make a concerted effort once they pass the hump of 50 to revitalize and be reborn, then if they're not planning for ways to do that, they need to be planning a funeral. Because statistically, that's just what happens. Between 50 and 70, churches either reboot or they decease. And so we need to decide whether or not Denby is going to reboot and renew or whether we're going to plan a funeral. And I want to suggest to you, and I'm open to contradiction. I mean, I'm not always right, seldom in doubt, but not always right. Any revitalization of our church is going to go right through our children's department. Because when we try to invite visitors to come, if they don't see that children are important to us, then it's going to be really hard for us to convince them to stay around and become part of our fellowship. So we need to decide which direction we're going to go. Luke puts an emphasis on children, and I think that encourages us to put an emphasis on children as well. Let's pray together.